Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I am so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have an amazing show coming right up. Our first guest is Paisley Rekdal. She's a 2017 Poet Laureate of Utah. She's the author of the book, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, and was also a finalist for the 2000 Kingsley Tufts Prize. So Paisley's here today to talk to us about her new book, The Broken Country. So let's welcome to the show, Paisley.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You know, I am so delighted that we're spending this time here today. I mean, my goodness, you are quite the literary wonder here.
That's kind of you to say. I wouldn't say that myself, but I appreciate other people thinking that.
Well, I know you're the winner of the Association of Writers and Writing Program Awards. I mean, you've got all these wonderful accolades, and I know you're a professor at in Utah, University of Utah. How long, before we get into your book, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background? Because I think it's just absolutely fascinating. I mean, writing's been a passion of yours.
I started writing when I was 16 years old, mostly poetry, and almost exclusively poetry for many years, though I did my graduate degree in medieval studies at the University of Toronto, and then I finally got an MFA in poetry at the University of Michigan. But because of my interest in writing and because I just like traveling, I've been very fortunate to live in so many different countries. I've lived in Ireland and Vietnam and Paris for a little while, Canada, obviously, for graduate school, and I've just traveled to so many different countries. Oh, and I've lived in Japan for a little while. I spent a lot of time traveling in Asia as well, and I'm biracial. I'm Chinese and Norwegian, basically as a mix. So I also come from a pretty interesting and diverse family, and I've been really fortunate with that. But yeah, I've been writing for most of my time, and I turn to nonfiction every once in a while, and this is one of my 3 nonfiction books.
Well, I can understand having diversity growing up and what a huge impact that makes. I grew up myself in Pasadena, and it was a melting pot of cultures and people, and it was absolutely fabulous. I loved it. And so it brings about a certain perspective that people who maybe aren't exposed to that go through.
I think that's true. I mean, with The Broken Country, it was interesting, though, because I'm the child of immigrants on both sides of my family, but because I thought that would give me a sort of an insight into a book in part about refugees and trauma. But, of course, refugees come from a very different place. Immigrants come to a country because they choose to come to a country. They settle usually with more economic means. They develop communities where they want to develop communities. But refugees are put in a different situation. They're forced to relocate, and they're often coming with pretty much no resources, and they're often put in cities and in communities that they would never choose on their own necessarily. And so what was interesting to me is that my diverse background both kind of helped and I wouldn't say hurt me, but really opened my eyes to the diversity that Southeast Asian refugees in particular experienced. But it also made me very familiar with some of the questions around cultural assimilation that I've been writing about most of my life, actually.
I think this is a perfect time to be having these conversations, especially on this topic. Now, your book, The Broken Country, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's funny. I was living in Vietnam next to the Vietnam Military History Museum, and I was on Facebook illegally, as everyone is on Facebook illegally in Vietnam, and reading some posts. And where I teach, the University of Utah, some of my colleagues posted this terrifying story of a young Vietnamese American man who went to the grocery store near where I live, very, very close to my house, and purchased a knife and began stabbing specifically white men while yelling things about the Vietnam War, a war that he personally couldn't have experienced due to his age, so it would have been something that affected his parents. And at that time, I was living in Hanoi. I was living, as I said, next door to this military history museum that had this sculpture that was of all of these different plane parts, basically from the French and American wars layered together. And I kept going and looking at the sculpture, and it really brought up all of these different and surprising feelings in me. I had never really thought that much about the Vietnam War. So when I got back and I read this piece, I thought, that is such a strange and odd story. And one of the people who had been stabbed was actually a student in the English department where I work. So I had thought about this, and when I came back to Salt Lake from Vietnam, I kind of checked in to see what happened with the crime, and the trial was still going at that point, and I just became really fascinated by the questions that it raised, because I'd never really thought about the long-term consequences of wars. I'd never really thought about how they affect families, not just in the immediate aftermath, but over generations. And what does it mean when we say a war is over? And in what ways do we preserve wars in ways that aren't actually very helpful for us over the long term in our culture? So that was, to me, the starting point of a series of questions I wanted to engage with.
I think that's what you mean by when you say that your book kind of pivots towards a larger discussion that we really need to be having here, in regards to refugees and immigrants who are coming not just to the United States, but just in general. I mean, because I think that it could be a discussion that any country could have.
I agree. I mean, right now, the world is undergoing the largest refugee crisis in the last 2 centuries. We have literally millions of people who've been displaced, and not just from Syria, but through lots of parts of Africa, North Africa, and also, again, in Southeast Asia, climate refugees. And they're pouring back into countries. I mean, you see the effects in Europe all of the time, and they're also, some are coming to the United States. But we do need to have a kind of conversation about what we mean when we say we are relocating people. What are the actual responsibilities around that? When we relocated basically almost 1 million Southeast Asian refugees post-1975, we did so out of a complex series of feelings of guilt and responsibility and fellowship and loyalty that very quickly turned and became almost, in many cases, anti-Asian sentiment. And one of the reasons why I think it was such a frustrating and difficult process of relocation for the Southeast Asian refugees is that we simply weren't prepared. We didn't have the language. We didn't set up mental health programs for the refugees that were coming through. We didn't do that for our own veterans, frankly, of that war. And we also didn't think about issues of housing. And we basically sort of treated the Vietnamese in some ways in a very American way. We said, we're going to divorce the idea of culture from citizenship. We will give you citizenship, but we're going to put you in communities that are mostly white in the hopes of making you assimilate as quickly as possible. And I think that this could have really negative, and it did have negative effects for some families where they weren't able to process the language as quickly. They were overwhelmed culturally. They felt that they were being isolated, and they were terrified. And it shut some people down, and we didn't have the infrastructure in place to deal with that. And it's been more than 40 years later. Now we have another worldwide refugee crisis, and I think we should take a little time to think about what are the other lessons we could learn from Vietnam and relocation. How is it that we can help the process of assimilation and relocation for so many refugees?
Well, and it's interesting. We look at that. And then I can remember I worked with a nonprofit, which I'm not going to mention which name, but they were dealing with people that had been displaced. It was a heavily populated area that had been displaced due to a fire. And this was people who were mostly immigrants and refugees. And they would go and they were picking up food that culturally they can't eat. It's not within their guidelines. And so it's interesting how this discussion can really touch on so many different, not just, from a government standpoint, but also when we look at other agencies that work with our government that could be helping people. What kind of discussions do they need to be having as well?
Yeah, I think the larger discussion we need to have is this idea about assimilation and what we think we mean and what we want to mean with assimilation. And your example is a great one, the issue of food. I mean, I was talking with one Vietnamese refugee as research for my book, and he mentioned food a lot. And it might sound weirdly trivial, but it isn't, because, I mean, what we're really talking about is the idea of giving up or foregoing one set of cultural norms, standards, senses of beauty, connection, simply to leap forward to another one. And if that's what we mean by assimilation, then we automatically sort of set up almost a standard of self-hatred for the immigrant or the refugee who comes into the country, right? Which is, you have to deny who you are and what you've been and all the things that you think make you in order to be like us. And I think that kind of cultural erasure that happens in something even as small as the wrong food and insisting that they eat it is part of this longer and larger discussion about the ways in which we want to erase certain types of identities and certain types of memories that we find unpleasant and uneasily assimilable. We did something similar, I think, with the American-born veterans of the Vietnam War, too. They came back, and we sort of basically implicitly said, whatever you do, don't tell us what you did. We saw what you did, or we can imagine what you did, or we don't want to know what you did, really. And I don't think that helped them very much either. So when we talk about assimilation, I think oftentimes what we're talking about is erasure and forgetting, and I don't think those things actually help anyone.
Yeah, I think that conversation really needs to be had at all levels, because, I mean, and you bring up so beautifully, it's like, what does that even mean? And it's like we're having different levels of expectation. For the immigrants and the refugees that are coming over, they have a different level of expectation, and we do too. And there's just a lack of communication there, and like how things are going to progress.
Yeah. I mean, I can say from my own family experience, and on both sides of the family, that that question of assimilation and erasure has been one that has been somewhat painful to members of my own family. My grandparents on my mother's side spoke Chinese, but they decided very quickly, like so many immigrant parents, to force the kids only to speak English. Yeah. And I think with the result that, my mother in particular feels, I think, a sense of kind of a little guilt and embarrassment that she can't speak a language because she was denied it, because, her parents really wanted her to be like everybody else. But interestingly, on the Norwegian side, I think there was also a sense of be American, eat American foods and, don't speak Norwegian either. And I think that's what's sort of interesting about the idea of assimilation is that it's based on a model that kind of doesn't fit for anyone, right? I mean, I think there are the standard of what the perfect and ideal American isn't one that I think even a lot of native-born Americans feel like they can identify with, because that person is, not only white or male and heterosexual and Protestant, but also probably wealthy, right? So there's all sorts of class and race and language and all sorts of markers in that body that, almost no one can, except for a very small group, can actually, quote unquote, assimilate to. And, one of the subjects I was talking to in my book said, it wasn't relocation itself. It wasn't the war that drove my family crazy. It was what happened to us once we got to America. This sense that we were just never going to fit in, and the crazy attempt to try and fit in would make, some people feel like maybe they were going a little mad. And I was really haunted by that statement.
That would be a haunting statement. I mean, I knew my great-grandmother very well, and she immigrated here from Portugal into Hawaii when it was a territory. And it's really interesting. I mean, she went through the same thing where, she spoke fluent Portuguese, but, she wasn't teaching any of her children Portuguese because of the way that it affected the way that they spoke English. which, I'm sure later on she kind of probably regrets a little bit because there was part of the heritage that's lost with all that.
Exactly. I mean, with every loss comes some gain, but with every gain comes some kind of a loss. Mm-hmm. Greater cultural access, which everyone wants for their kids, right, also comes with a sort of diminishment of the sense of one's family's history. And the question that I think can only be raised and continually asked is, how do you create that balance? I don't think there's any obvious model to follow, but I think we have to question the models that we think are the models to follow.
What do you think are some of the other questions that we should be, talking about, we should be bringing up when we talk about people that are immigrating here?
Well, and again, the difference between immigration and being a refugee. I mean, if we're thinking about being a refugee, I think the uncomfortable discussion we have to have that my book does raise is the one about trauma in general and the ways that science and epigenetic research has demonstrated that trauma and PTSD are things that can be inherited. This is not to say that everyone who has experienced a traumatic event is traumatized. In fact, one of the things that becomes really interesting when you look at the research about the Southeast Asian refugees and also returning veterans from the Vietnam War, we have enough longitudinal data on both sets to see this. The real story is actually one of resilience, but what is fascinating is that even though both populations have higher rates, elevated rates of mental health problems, that those mental health problems seem to be heritable down to second and third generations, and they remain elevated. Again, elevated is not universal, but we have to have a kind of uncomfortable conversation around if we know that war does this. We know it does that to its combatants and its victims and its non-combatant participants alike. Then when we say, again, a war is over, what responsibility do we take for the survivors? Because it's not as simple as sort of saying, okay, now we just relocate people, we bring them back home. We also have to have a conversation about what do we know about PTSD and how it gets transferred through generations, not just through our bodies, but through the stories that we culturally tell ourselves about that war. And if we do that, the reason it's uncomfortable is, of course, this is the same argument that I think a lot of people would use to shut down borders and to build walls, right? Because somehow we're going to protect ourselves. We can find a space of perfect protection where nobody can threaten us. And I think that's a fantasy. We know that immigration and relocation will always happen at some level. So the question is, I think, how is it that we can make our mental health services better prepared to deal with that? How do we work with communities in the ways that they need to help them sort of get through and survive that kind of relocation process more successfully? I think the number one thing we don't do is slash mental health budgets at both the state and federal level. Yeah, and and really have. I think it would be. It would just behoove us to have a mental health counselor that kind of works with families and communities as they are, arriving, in the U.S. and just kind of helping them through that process. Because, a lot of these, we have no idea what they've been through. Right, we don't. And oftentimes the first people who are really aware of these problems and have to deal with it are the people who are already burdened. It's our healthcare system that really takes the brunt of this. And it's also our police system. Our prisons are filled with people who are basically classified as mentally ill. And where I am right now, we're actually having a big fight about where to move our state prison. And the fight is in part due to issues of land. They need space to house what they say are the growing population of mentally ill offenders who they're also arguing really shouldn't be in prison at all. They should be in community health centers and all these other things. All of the discussions that we might have around relocation and trauma are also questions that we would have to have around our ideas about policing and our ideas about what we think healthcare should be too. And I think that's why it's so sticky and so difficult. But, if we are going to acknowledge and accept and, relocate people, then we have to sort of say, this isn't just a let them in and give them an apartment question. This is a question of what is the infrastructure that we have in place already look like, and how well prepared is it to deal with people who are going to be the first people needing more of these services potentially.
In your studies and your research that you've done on this topic, how prepared do you think we are currently, and what are some of the things that, just from a community level, let's say, because our if you're talking about slashing budgets for healthcare and that affects so many other things, like what can the average person do to get involved and help?
That's a great question, and I don't even know if I know the answer, because most of the people I know who are doing work with refugees are doing it on a sort of smaller, almost volunteer basis. Mm-hmm. But I think the larger question of what we could do is, we have to really care about what we decide for our health care budget and what we really decide for our health care plan. I think people have been really roiled by that debate because we've been caring gratefully about ourselves and our immediate family, but that immediate family is about to grow, I think. Ever since Obamacare was first put in, and it's been a fight, letting that program die, I think, is a huge mistake. It's a mistake for us as citizens, but it's a big mistake for the returning veterans of war that we have. We were still fighting wars. And one of the things that I've discovered during the research of my book is that, the data that we're getting on the Vietnam veterans is probably going to be quite similar to the data we're going to get about the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So, that's a 40-year, 50-year problem out from now. And so healthcare is a huge issue to continue to care about, not just for ourselves, but for our soldiers and, as I said, as refugees. So, in that sense, writing and calling your senators and Congress people becomes an extremely important act.
And it's kind of like, what we need to do at this present point in time, because I was involved personally with Warrior Hike, which helps veterans, combat veterans, who are, coming back and, help them to assimilate into society by taking these long hikes through, like the different trails that we have across America. And it would take them 6 months at a time, but allows them to decompress and to be feeling to the point where they're starting to feel like themselves a little bit.
Yeah, I read about that program, and it's a great program. And I think thinking sort of outside the box, like you're pointing out in that kind of program, to think about the kind of rituals that might actually be healing and helpful. I read a while ago Sebastian Junger, I think in The Tribe. I can't remember which book, unfortunately, but he talks about a particular kind of ritual that soldiers would do. They called it blood in, blood out, where, if they go on leave for an extended period of time, they would be physically beaten up by their fellow troops. And then they would be beaten again when they came back into the troop. And it sounds horrible and awful, but it also was a fascinating look into the psychology of recognizing you were leaving one space to enter another. And I think one of the things that our experience assimilating refugees post-1975 was there was no respect for that. The refugee camp was that space that was to signal you were leaving one space and entering another. But what's interesting about, I think, the refugees of that war and refugees who are fleeing countries whose governments are falling is that you're not just leaving a place, you're leaving a country that may no longer exist. And you're entering into a place then that can only be experienced again through memory or through your parents' imagination or through sort of shared cultural memory. And it makes it even harder to sort of feel as if you belong somewhere, I think. And I can't be,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds kind of frivolous maybe for someone who hasn't experienced that, but from talking to people, I can see how deeply and powerfully these kinds of narratives shape families. And a respect for and an understanding that when you leave one space and you enter another, there might be some sort of interim space to give you some sort of respite, to let you cross through, would be helpful, because in some ways I think for a lot of post-1975 refugees, they're still crossing through because the place they left is absolutely gone, and the place that they entered into has no recognition of that. And
from what it sounds like, I mean, because I don't really know firsthand. I think back at just the brief history of my family immigrating here. But, for refugees and people, it sounds like that there's such a rush and things are so chaotic as they're going through and, then let's say they get to the United States and then now they have to hurry up and get a job and hurry up and do this, that they really don't have the downtime to really kind of work through their emotions or even know if there's availability to have people help them with that.
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting is, when I talk to the people who experienced the crime, the people who were
mm-hmm.
stabbed, Tim DeJulis
mm-hmm.
and Barney, they actually had a very similar experience to what we're talking about with refugees. And I bring that up in the book, too, which is that oftentimes when we think about a violent event or something like that, we focus in on the event and then we forget what happens to the victims. We don't pay attention to what happens to the refugees.
Mm-hmm.
But, like Tim DeJulis often would say that he felt that the whole point of him being rehabilitated from being stabbed so viciously was just to get him back to work. And he said, I just really wish I could have a moment where I could sit and process how drastically my life changed. I mean, he was stabbed in the brain, and basically his personality changed dramatically. Lots of elements of his life changed dramatically. But nothing about life overall would accommodate that. And I think it made it even harder for him and more frustrating for him. And it's, in a way, a parallel experience for people coming from, fleeing war, moving to a different space, right? You're just,
mm-hmm.
there's no moment to sit down and say, okay, what does this mean? How do I process that?
Well, and I think looking back, it'd be easy to see how different feelings and emotions could be transferred to children, because if they look back on, kind of the nostalgic point of view that they used to have of an area or how things used to be, before whatever war event took place, it would be really hard to, kind of leave that behind and maybe even be able to be more present and say, okay, well, hey, at least this is a great place. I mean, it seems like there would be a little bit of a disconnect with some of that.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I sort of discovered writing this book when I was thinking about trauma is that trauma
mm-hmm.
is both a genetic injury but also a cultural one. I mean, it can be genetic in the sense that we can inherit PTSD from our parents, potentially, but also it's cultural in the sense that, if our parents tell us stories about a traumatic war or a traumatic event that you might not remember having experienced when you were relocated,
mm-hmm.
those stories become part of our consciousness. And so a child that is born in the United States, a second or third generation out, growing up hearing these stories, enters into another kind of imaginative space that's also difficult to navigate, which is that the parents' memories sort of twine into their own memories too. And it does shape their worldview, and it can create sort of certain traumatic effects, I think, on the child's way of perceiving his or her presence, his or her place in the world right there.
Yeah.
And, so it doesn't surprise me sometimes when people have this outraged response to crimes that are committed. They're very rare, by the way, crimes that are committed mm-hmm. by immigrants or refugees, which is just, especially if they were born here, like descendants. Like, well, they were born here. Why would they have this anger? Why would they lash out like this? And I think part of it is that we are discounting the powerful effects that narrative has in shaping identity in families and on individuals. And so while they themselves may not have had an experience of war, that is not to say they have not experienced some part of war.
Well, and all families go through their different programming, regardless of what that might be. So I can see where this would be a parallel as well, because, no matter how well-meaning parents are, sometimes they will have a narrative that they're programming the children with, like, money doesn't grow on trees, or, it's not safe to swim, or whatever the thing is, And
right.
So I can see where some of this narrative would actually be passed down as well. But I find it to be absolutely a fascinating discussion because no one's really talking about it except for you in regards to how it's affecting immigrants and refugees and also our veterans.
I think the reason we don't want to have this conversation is that because it really is, frankly, politically messy. If you are left-leaning and you acknowledge what is an uncomfortable or an inconvenient truth in this matter, you risk, I think, falling into a kind of very, very conservative ideology that would say, well, then fine, we should have no more immigrants, we should have no more refugees. And if you focus in on it, there's a chance that it can go the wrong way. But if you also want to whitewash it and out of a kind of sense of being politically open, argue that, there are no problems, then I think that causes some problems too, because then that means that we don't have to have these resources in place for returning veterans and refugees. The reality is that, as I said before, an elevated risk does not mean a universal risk, but it does mean there's a risk. And the risk is often simply more of self-harm than it is of, this example of this young man who goes and buys a knife at the grocery store and stabs people. His crime is spectacular and rare, and that's in some ways the irony or the paradox of the book. He both is a portrait of a nation, and he's also not a good example of that because he is so rare. But we focus in on it because it's, I focus in on it because it's a flashy and terrifying story, and it satisfies some sort of voyeuristic spectacle in all of us. But that's not to say we shouldn't have this conversation overall. We have to be able to say, if there are risks and we know about them over time, what can we do to mitigate them? What can we do to reach out to people before they actually become, real threats?
Well, and it's just fascinating, the discussion on this too, because I think that overall, if we don't look at it from through any political lens, it's really a human issue, that we're dealing with. And how can we best address this? And I think your story, why it might be salacious in some ways, is one that makes us look at it and go, okay, where did we fail as humanity here? How can we do things better? Because obviously something went wrong for us for that to have happened. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think it's a good way of putting it. I mean, in some respects, we have politicized something that doesn't actually have to be politicized. If we look at it as a question of medicine and science and look at it as what are some things that we can do as preventative measures, then the answers become clearer because we can say, okay, well, these are the kinds of community organizations we need, and we need people who can speak these kinds of languages, and we need people, to work in communities and to get out the word and to, have more culturally sensitive practices, and we need to make sure our healthcare system is healthier for everyone. All of these things are things that can be done, and, ultimately they become beneficial to all of us. It is, in that sense, a basic human question. I mean, the thing is, if you look at research, I know I'm focusing in on the Southeast Asian refugee crisis, and part of that is due to the fact that we have a lot of data on Southeast Asian refugees. But we also have a lot of data on Holocaust victims, and we have a lot of data on American Indian families. And what's interesting is that they track, basically, each other. And so it's not as if this is just a question of immigration and relocation. This is what happens to human bodies, as you would put it, I think, over time when exposed to traumatic genocide and war. And if we know that, then we can transfer that, information to all sorts of different groups who are going to need that help.
Paisley, you are such a luminary. It would be so easy to spend an enormous amount of time talking not only about your amazing book, but just, hearing you talk on this topic. I think more discussion needs to be had, and I'm so grateful you wrote this book. It's absolutely fabulous. Before we get going, we're obviously at the end of our time here, unfortunately. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Oh, well, thank you for all of this. So I have a website, PaisleyRekdal.com. I'm on Twitter at Paisley Rekdal, very original, and then I'm on Facebook as well, and you can always reach me through the University of Utah's English Department website. So thank you so much for having me. This is just a delight.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy to have you here. We are going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
This is Jennifer McGill. My highly anticipated new album, Unbreakable, is now available at jennifermcgill.com. Everything from power ballads to high-energy jam-out-in-your-car songs. I used my highest joys and deepest pains to create empowering songs of love, strength, healing, and restoration so that you can be unbreakable too. Get your copy of Unbreakable today from jennifermcgill.com. Because who doesn't want to be unbreakable?
The highly acclaimed and newly released book, The Hand Part 2 by Lynn Van Praagh Grattan, describes the journey between a psychic medium and a family who lost a son. Messages from Beyond Eternity's Gate is of love and healing. For more information, visit www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com. That's www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com.
Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted to be introducing our next guest, Philip Kitcher, and he's here today to talk to us about his book, The Season Altar. So let's welcome to the show, Philip.
Thank you very much, Marianne.
Oh, what a joy it is to have you here. And what an amazing book. I mean, my goodness, I've got to ask you, what was your inspiration for The Season's Altar?
Well, both Evelyn and I have, we're getting on in years now, have for a decade worried about the problem of climate change, and we've had so many other things that have occupied both of us, but we kept coming back to it and saying, well, mother, we really do have to write something on this. And other people said to us, you really do have to write something on it. And so we tried to write a sort of systematic view that might contribute a little bit of structure to the discussion of issues around climate change. And then our editor at Norton said, I think this needs to be more dialogical than it is. And I thought, dialogical? dialogue. I used to write dialogues. I used to write plays. What we really need is to make this a dialogue between people who like one another, who are sympathetic, but who disagree. Because that's really what this issue needs at the moment, a set of models for achieving some kind of mutual understanding on a very complicated issue on which tempers often run very high.
Well, it's really interesting. So when people talk about climate change, it seems that the discussion can be somewhat polarized. You know, it doesn't seem there's a whole lot of middle ground.
Yeah.
So how is it possible? And you know about this. I mean, gosh, you are a professor at Columbia University. So I mean, you're all about science. So I mean, this is something that you have really been interested in quite some time.
Yeah. So let me begin by saying it isn't just about science. That's what makes it so complicated. It's about science, it's about society, it's about economics, it's about ethical issues, it's about political issues, it's about how individual people should live and how we should all live together. That's what makes it so complex. And these issues often get run together. People don't react in one way to the scientific evidence because they're worried about the economic consequences, and they're worried about their lives, and they're worried about what's going to happen to their society. And all of this gets sort of muscled up in their thinking about it. So it really is hard. On the other hand, this is one of those questions that we can't just run away from. Because, if you go around saying, well, the jury's out, nobody really knows, let's just wait and see, you're going to wait until it's too late. The planet is changing, so that climate scientists tell us, and if we really do just say, well, we want more evidence, we want you to nail down the details, then if they're right, then we're going to be stuck with a world that will be very difficult for human beings to live in. So we have to try to figure it out and decide whether we need to take action now or not, because it's just deciding not to decide is the same as deciding that the scientific evidence is just wrong, just not good enough. You can't. There's no sort of middle ground, no fence on which you can sit and just say, well, I can leave that and postpone it for a bit. No, it's now or we will have effectively made a decision.
Well, no decision is a decision.
Exactly.
So, like you were saying, and so it kind of brings us to some of the basic questions that I think polarizes this discussion so much, because there's so much talk about, is climate change real? And is it not? I think anyone seeing like the weather that we've been experiencing with the hurricanes on the East Coast, you have to just pause and look at this.
Now, climate scientists are very fond of saying, no, you can't really see individual events as being signals of climate change. It's all about patterns. Mm-hmm. This is very similar to kinds of things we've seen before. So when there were nuclear tests and people sometimes found themselves in the vicinity of nuclear tests, incidences of various kinds of cancers went up, sometimes quite sharply. But it was very difficult to say of any individual case, oh, this guy got cancer because he was too close. What you can say is there's a good explanation for why there are now so many more people in this particular area having the cancers, and that's the nuclear tests. But it's very difficult to pin it down to single events or even small clusters of events. So you have to be a bit wary about this. But you're right. There is a pattern. I mean, we're seeing years in which record temperatures for the average temperature of the planet are broken year after year. And we're seeing much greater frequency of really extreme weather events, not just hurricanes and storms, but droughts and floods. and heat waves. All of this is happening, and it's happening in various places around the world. No continent gets to go unscathed in all of this. So it's the pattern that's signaling to us that the planet's climate is changing.
Well, and so if we're looking at the patterns, is it as urgent as, the scientists would suggest that we need to go ahead and make some changes now, or is it something, and I know you kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, is it something that we can wait 5, 10, 20 years?
It's already too late to prevent some things. So people will say, well, yeah, okay, so it's happening, we're causing it. Does it really matter? People will just move to different parts of the globe. If Africa gets to be too hot, the people who live there can, move north. If the southern part of the United States gets too hot, there's plenty of room in North Dakota and Minnesota and so on and so forth. That really doesn't come to terms with the problem, because the problem isn't that, the average temperature in some part of the world will be a little bit too hot for comfort, or the sea level on average will rise a little bit, and so places near the coastline will see a little bit of water, and people will see a little bit of water and coming up through their kitchen floors, as I'm told is already happening in parts of Florida. No, the real trouble are the episodes, it's the fluctuations around the average, not the average itself that's so deadly. And that's what we've seen, of course, in the recent frequency of very powerful storms and very powerful heat waves and very powerful droughts and so forth. So it's the episodes, the things that occur at the tails of the distribution of events, not the average things, but the things that are out on the bad end that should really bother us. And that's going to disturb this sort of serene picture of people, gradually picking up and moving from region to region. One of the consequences of all of this is that these things tend to interact with one another. I'm glad you brought up the recent hurricanes. I mean, we've had Texas battered, followed by Florida being battered, followed by Puerto Rico being battered. Now, if you imagine that just getting worse and worse and worse and being combined with other kinds of events, you can see in the future, in say 20, 50, 100 years' time, this country being hit with far more of those kinds of episodes in a short period of time. All of a sudden, just as you're coping with the big storm on the East Coast, you've also got to cope with a drought in the Southwest, and you've got to cope with heavy rains in the Northern Pacific and wildfires somewhere else and floods in the heart of the country. You can begin to see how difficult this is going to be. And the United States is in the sort of middle range of parts of the world. We're not likely to get off as lightly as Europe will do, but we're not going to suffer as much as parts of Asia and Africa, where things are really going to be disruptive, terribly disruptive. And if you think about the future, all of these things interact with, social and political events. As the economy of one country gets disrupted, as, people lose access to water, there are opportunities for all sorts of old tensions to erupt. People will be forced to migrate. I mean, the kinds of migrations that have caused so much trouble in the European context are going to be dwarfed by the migrations of the future. And as the climate changes, animals and plants shift their ranges, and they come into contact with one another in ways they didn't before, and that gives new opportunities for diseases to arise and for diseases that are found in some animals to make a jump to human beings. I think it's impossible to say what the probability of a serious pandemic, a serious plague as a result of climate change within the next, say, 50 years is. But it's not really, really small. It's not something we can forget about. So you can see all of these things combining with one another and making a future in which human life all over the world becomes very precarious and uncertain.
It was interesting when I recently was in North Carolina during when the hurricane hit Florida. And you talk about migration. There are a lot of people coming up from Florida into Georgia, into South Carolina and North Carolina and beyond, and all the hotels were booked. You couldn't get a hotel anywhere. And just kind of seeing how that is, and people trying to get flights out, and just, how difficult that was. I remember watching, on one of the national networks, there was a mayor of some town that was talking about this being the new norm for, I think it was Florida, and how to kind of explain.
Not the new norm. This is just the beginning of. So now imagine that those people have not had clean water for several days, that lots of them are sick, that they've got to travel long distances, that the roads are blocked, that the supplies of gasoline have run out, that the public transportation system has broken down. And imagine those kinds of journeys on foot or, in very sort of, in very slow-moving vehicles, and people coming into situations where others are already struggling. The kinds of things that the migrations out of Europe are already beginning to show you, and those are going to happen all over the place. So what you saw is a kind of nice, genteel, rather civilized version of the future. There are still hotels that are running. Well, they may be full, but, maybe people can be squeezed in. Yeah, try that without rooms at all, where all sorts of features of everyday life have been threatened or even devastated. That's not going to be anywhere near as easy as the real difficulties that you saw. I mean, those are just the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.
And it's easy to imagine out, especially with you talking through this, what some of these possibilities can be. And so for people who, and your book was so well written, and I loved how you formatted it. It was easy to see that you made this dialogue between, somebody who's kind of a skeptic and not quite sure, and someone who's just really kind of, gung-ho about doing what they can to save the planet. But there comes this, this discussion as well. It's like, okay, well, we've got normal lives and we have family, and how do you make things work with all of this stuff going on? Like, how can you have a civilized conversation about climate change and still be able to maintain somewhat of a life?
Yeah, well, that's, of course, many people, I think, very reasonably say, you tell me about these problems in the future. I've got terrible problems in the present. I'm struggling to make ends meet. The schools my kids go to are just not that great, and they're having a tough time. And I really want a better life for them than it looks as though they're going to be able to have. We have to take on these sorts of problems into our, discussions with one another and into our political discussions much more seriously. The swift answer to that is, if you invest all your thinking in trying to solve these problems of today, important as though they are, and don't do anything about the future, then the problems for your children and your grandchildren are going to be much worse than the ones you're experiencing now. So you're going to have to somehow balance between the ways in which you try to address the difficulties of the present and the difficulties of the future. So I don't know whether you noticed this, but we began our book with a really sort of apocalyptic scenario where the human population, the human species, nearly gets to go extinct. Only less than 1% of human beings on the planet survive. And we end with something that's just much more ordinary and everyday. You know, life as it might be for old people under climate change, maybe 50, 40 years from now. And, you know, the weather is hot and the power doesn't always function. And the stores are out of painkillers. And the food isn't as fresh as it might be. And the water looks brownish, and you boil the water for your tea and or your coffee. You don't drink it straight. And the cell phone service is iffy, and your kids and their families are in places that are currently experiencing a really nasty storm. It's not very, big or apocalyptic. It's pretty banal. We call that dialogue the banality of suffering, borrowing a phrase from Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil. But it's really disconcerting. And imagine that kind of vulnerability, going on month after month. And people at the ends of their lives, or struggling with their children, or people at the beginnings of their lives trying to set out and make their way in that kind of unpredictable world. You can begin to see why it's important to do something about it now. So our message is really that it's time for governments all over the world to take the existing problems of their citizens more seriously than they have been doing, and to prepare for the future. Both of these things are going to have to be done. And we're a relatively rich country, and we spend a lot of money, I think, very unwisely. And it's time, I think, to sit down with one another and think about what the serious priorities are. What are the things that we really want for our lives? What can we manage without? What can we sacrifice? What can we change without really affecting our happiness and the prospects of our children? And what are the things that we really, really need for human lives to go in the way we want them to go? And I think that's a hard conversation to have, but it's the conversation, it's a political conversation, and it's the individual conversation that we have to be trying to develop now. And our book is an attempt to try to start that process.
And I think you did it so well. The book is very well written and walks you through. It was fabulous, and just walks you through these different things that are going on, and for our listeners who are wanting to make some changes now, what are some ways that they can look to effect change, not just in their own lives, but within their community, maybe their government?
Yeah. So I think democracy is a wonderful, wonderful institution. Mm-hmm. It's got all sorts of problems, and we know what the problems are. But democracy thrives on people exchanging ideas with one another, learning from one another, and coming together and doing things jointly. And so what we would love to see is lots of working this through in families, in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, in workplaces, in PTA meetings, in sitting around watching the kids play at the park. Just work it through and try to form a grassroots network, a movement that says, let's think all together about the human problems. Let's have a political movement that asks our leaders, our democratically elected leaders, to respond to this problem and to think about it in a comprehensive economic context where we actually try to put in place protections for the people whose lives are bound to be disrupted as we switch from using fossil fuels to using other sources of energy, and try to find ways of preserving what is most important for human beings in their lives. That's really the task. You know, the Pope has said this, as we say towards the end of our book. The Pope has said it, other religious leaders have said it, and people who have humanist sympathies all over the world are going to think it too. And, you know, it's a matter of asking ourselves, you know, do we really need the big cars? Do we really need the big houses? Do we really need such enormous inequalities of wealth that we have? How should we best be working together? And I think all of this is tremendously important, and we need to do it if we're going to make our planet habitable and life good for our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and those who come after them.
So it's not just a U.S. problem or a Canada problem, or it has to be addressed on a global level.
Yeah, it does, and that of course has posed great difficulties. I mean, we are behind because it took a very long time for there even to be a serious agreement. That was, of course, made in Paris in 2015, in December 2015. It was a great moment of hope, and thanks to our president before this one, Barack Obama, because he really worked very hard to put it together. It was nowhere near enough, nowhere near fast enough. All people who have been following this for decades said, "Oh, what a relief, something's finally happening," and then with the next breath said, "But of course much more is needed than is being asked for in Paris." But it was a start. And then, of course, this year, the new administration has backed away from that. It's a terrible retrograde step. But there's still hope. I hope that we will go back and make sure that there is global cooperation. As we say in the book, it's as though we're fighting a war, and it's all human beings on one side and it's atmospheric greenhouse gases on the other. And we better get together and form an alliance and do what we can to try to limit the bad effects those greenhouse gases are going to have on future human life. And in an alliance in wartime, you sometimes have to work together with people you don't particularly like and whose values you surely don't share, as both Roosevelt and Churchill did with Stalin in the Second World War. So sometimes we're going to have to sit down with people with whom it's difficult to reach agreement, and we're going to have to try to reach agreement because the species depends on our reaching agreement. That's going to complicate matters a lot, and the fact that there are countries that have contributed in no way to the industrialization and the effects that it's had on the atmosphere, their existence is going to cause further problems because they're yearning for development. They feel they've been left behind in the world. And they're going to ask, why can't we do what you've done? And the answer is, well, you can't do it because we did it, and unfortunately that path is no longer available. And we're going to have to cooperate with them and try to help them along the way. So, as I say, it's going to be a matter of figuring out what's really important in human life and making sure that members of our species across the world have a planet in which those kinds of things can be retained, and the things that we can do without given up in order to make sure that future human life can be as happy and wonderful as it has been for some of us.
And I think ignoring it doesn't make the problem go away.
No way.
It just kind of circles back, and the discussion keeps coming up because whether it's something that is as obvious and kind of in our face as some of the patterns that you were discussing, that we would look for in order to determine if we're, in that phase, which we already are. It's really interesting because, the topic really wants to be discussed. And what's really interesting is a lot of millennials are very interested in, the planet and recycling and what they can do to make sure that their carbon footprint is as small as possible. So I think there's a lot of hope with that because we can engage a younger generation with coming up and helping us, with these changes.
I agree. Look, I want to be less gloomy towards the end. It's not hopeless. It's not hopeless. There are things we can do as individuals, and there are things that the world can do cooperatively. I would love it if in 20 years' time, because of the efforts, conservation on the one hand, and perhaps because of some technological breakthrough, we could say goodbye to this problem. Suppose, that what we had was, a transformation of a lot of stuff to non-renewable sources of energy, and at the same time, limited possibilities for using fossil fuels because people found some way to use them on a limited scale without belching more carbon into the atmosphere. Perhaps somebody might even discover a way of sucking some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. This would all be great, and life would go on. But we can't rely on there being a single technological breakthrough which would do the whole thing. And so we need the enthusiastic efforts of young people. They actually have a greater stake in this than any of us. Old people like me, are probably not going to live to see the worst parts of all of this. But those who are now young will surely see some bad things. And my grandchildren, who are very little, are going to, they're going to be really threatened by some of the things that are going to happen unless we find a way out. So our suggestion is pursue a lot of different strategies. See what works, and then if it works, make sure that everybody gets to share it. Don't say, well, we've got a way to work, and now we can really go ahead and dominate the world. No, this is for all of us. So I would like to see a commitment worldwide for people to try to find solutions, to share solutions, and to make sure that future generations all over the world will have better lives. And it's certainly not impossible. It's not impossible, but there aren't guarantees that we'll just get out of it through some brilliant bit of science. Worth investing in it. Encourage lots of those young people to go into science and engineering and try to find good ways to deal with atmospheric carbon. But also make sure that you've got a plan B, because without a plan B, the future is really going to be awful. I don't think it's hopeless. I just want us to have the will to work together and to try to succeed at this.
Well, there's always hope, and and that's. I think your book explains that as well. It has that feeling in it that there's always hope, and it starts the dialogue on this discussion, which can get a little gloomy, and I'm glad that we were able to boomerang that one out.
Well, it's wrong. I mean, I've so often talked and in front of people, and has been so depressing. There is hope. And the dialogues are intended to be constructive and to be to work towards hope and possibilities of solution, but they are framed by the apocalyptic scenario of the very beginning and the banal suffering of the end. as reminders of what's at stake here. So I think you need both. You need both of these things: the serious worry that it's going to be terrible, and at the same time the concrete plans. Let's go forward. Let's try these directions and see if we can win this war against carbon.
What a delightful discussion, Philip. Thank you so much for just taking the time to be on the show with us today.
Well, thank you. Yeah. This is as you can probably tell, very important to me. Evelyn and I have, invested our energy because we felt that this is such an important issue, and we would love it if there's just a little bit of effect that people are moved in some way to sort of start thinking about this. There are more conversations, more agreement, more cooperation, and a little bit more pressure on politicians to do the things that they need to do to help us get beyond these problems. Thank you so much, Marianne.
Oh, thank you. It's been such a joy to spend this time with you. It's a much needed topic to discuss. You've been listening to Philip Kitcher, the author of The Seasons Alter on Moments with Marianne. So unfortunately, that's the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to tune in. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.